At his birthday party, surrounded by his friends and family, my boyfriend laughed in my face and said he had the right to date any woman he wanted and do whatever he pleased because I was lucky to even be with him. Everyone in that penthouse apartment nodded in agreement, including his mother, except me. I smiled calmly and asked him how it would feel to know that the apartment he was standing in, the car he drove, and the business he bragged about building from nothing all belonged to me. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The champagne glasses stopped mid-air. His confident smirk dissolved into confusion, then horror. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to this morning, when I was still playing the role of the grateful girlfriend, not knowing that by tonight I would reveal that I owned everything he thought made him superior to me. The morning of March 15th started the way every morning had started for the past 4 years. I woke at 5:30 in the silent darkness of our bedroom in the Chicago penthouse, careful not to disturb Derek as he slept peacefully on his side of our king-sized bed. The sheets were Italian cotton, 1,000 thread count, ordered from a boutique in Milan that I had discovered during my research into luxury textiles. Derek believed he had impeccable taste. He had no idea that every carefully curated detail of our life together had been selected by me and presented to him as suggestions that he enthusiastically claimed as his own decisions. I moved through our morning routine with the precision of a choreographed performance that I had perfected over 48 months. The espresso machine in our kitchen was a $15,000 Italian import that I had purchased under the guise of a bonus Derek received from a client deal. I programmed it the night before so that his double espresso would be ready at exactly 6:45, the moment he typically emerged from the bedroom. While the machine hummed and hissed, I prepared his breakfast according to specifications that had evolved into non-negotiable requirements. 2 poached eggs, cooked for exactly 3.5 minutes so the yolks remained liquid gold. Whole grain avocado toast with a precise arrangement of microgreens that I drove to the farmer's market every Saturday morning to obtain. Fresh squeezed grapefruit juice, strained 3 times to ensure no pulp contaminated his morning experience. The kitchen was a showpiece of modern design, all white marble and stainless steel, with windows that overlooked Lake Michigan from the 42nd floor. Derek loved telling people that he had designed this space himself, working with the contractor to create his vision of culinary perfection. He neglected to mention that I had spent 6 months researching kitchen design, creating detailed sketches, and managing every aspect of the renovation while he was traveling for business. When friends complimented the space, he accepted their praise with the easy confidence of someone who believed his own revised history. I heard the bedroom door open at 6:43, 2 minutes earlier than usual. Derek appeared in the hallway wearing the silk robe I had given him for Christmas, his dark hair still tousled from sleep, scrolling through his phone with the absorbed attention of someone checking messages that were far more important than acknowledging my presence. He had the kind of conventional handsomeness that photographed well and open doors, strong jaw, clear blue eyes, the perpetual hint of a smile that suggested he was in on a joke that others were not sophisticated enough to understand. "Morning," he said without looking up from his screen, settling onto one of the bar stools at the kitchen island. His tone carried the casual dismissiveness of someone addressing household staff, rather than a romantic partner. "Did you remember that I have the partner meeting today? I need the navy Tom Ford suit. Make sure it's pressed." I slid his breakfast across the marble countertop, the plate positioned so that the toast was on his dominant right side, the eggs perfectly centered, the microgreens arranged to provide visual appeal without interfering with his ability to eat efficiently. For years of observation had taught me exactly how Derek preferred his world organized, and I had become expert at providing that organization while remaining invisible in the process. "The suit is already pressed and hanging in your closet," I replied, pouring his espresso into the cup he preferred, white porcelain with a gold rim that he believed conveyed success and refinement. I also laid out the burgundy tie and the Italian leather shoes, the ones from the Rome trip. Derek glanced up briefly, his expression registering mild surprise that I had anticipated his needs before he articulated them, followed immediately by the settled expectation that this was simply how things should function. "Good," he said, returning his attention to his phone. "I might be late tonight. The partners are talking about going to that new steakhouse in River North after the meeting. You know how these things go." I did know how these things went. He would return home after midnight, smelling of expensive scotch and cigars, full of stories about deals being negotiated and connections being made with men who controlled access to the upper echelons of Chicago's business community. He would talk at me for 20 minutes about the brilliant observations he had made, and the impressive ways he had positioned himself for the next opportunity, never once asking about my day or acknowledging that I might have experiences worth sharing. Then he would fall asleep mid-sentence, and I would lie awake in the darkness, wondering how I had allowed myself to become so thoroughly erased. But that was before. Before tonight. Before the moment that was now less than 12 hours away, when everything Derek believed about himself and about me would shatter like the champagne flutes I was certain someone would drop when I spoke the truth. I watched him eat the breakfast I had prepared, scrolling through his phone between bites, occasionally making small sounds of approval or interest in response to whatever he was reading. He existed in a bubble of self-absorption so complete that he had never stopped to consider how the life he was living had materialized around him. The apartment, the car, the clothes, the carefully curated social connections, the business opportunities that seemed to fall into his lap with suspicious regularity. Derek attributed all of it to his natural talent and magnetic personality. He had constructed an entire identity around being the kind of man who made things happen through sheer force of charisma and intelligence. The reality was substantially different, but he would not learn that until tonight. After Derek left for his office at 7:45, kissing my cheek with the absent affection one might show a family pet, I finally allowed myself to drop the performance. My shoulders, held rigid with tension, relaxed slightly. My face, arranged in pleasant accommodation, shifted into something more neutral. I poured myself a real cup of coffee, not the espresso Derek preferred but a dark roast from a small Colombian cooperative that I had discovered on my own, and carried it to the second bedroom that officially functioned as a guest room but actually served as my private office. Derek had been inside this room perhaps 3 times in 4 years. He had no reason to enter, believing as he did that I spent my days engaged in the kinds of activities that women who did not work occupied themselves with. Shopping perhaps, meeting friends for lunch, attending yoga classes or getting my nails done. He never asked for details about my schedule, and I never volunteered information. His lack of curiosity about my actual life was both insulting and convenient. I unlocked the door and stepped into a space that contained the truth of who I was beneath the performance I maintained for Derek's benefit. 2 monitors sat on an elegant desk positioned to catch the morning light from the east-facing windows. A Herman Miller chair, purchased with my own money and delivered while Derek was traveling. Filing cabinets that contained 4 years of carefully organized documentation. And on the wall, my MBA diploma from Northwestern University's Kellogg School of Management, class of 2019, graduated with distinction. Derek knew I had an MBA. What he did not know was that I had used the $2 million inheritance from my grandmother's estate to build a private equity portfolio that now controlled significant shares in 17 different companies across Chicago and the surrounding region. He did not know that the venture capital firm that had provided his business with its initial funding was actually one of my shell companies, Catalyst Ventures, operating through layers of legal entities specifically designed to obscure my involvement. He did not know that I sat on the board of that venture capital firm under my middle name, Sarah Chan, using my mother's maiden name to ensure that Derek never made the connection between his girlfriend and the investor who controlled his professional fate. For 4 years I had funded Derek's life while watching him take credit for success that I had engineered. For 4 years I had listened to him explain business concepts to me that I had taught myself years before he understood them. For 4 years I had smiled and nodded and played the role of the woman who was so fortunate to be with a man of his caliber. And for 4 years I had been waiting for the right moment to stop pretending. I opened my laptop and pulled up the file I had been compiling for the past 6 months. Tonight was Derek's 32nd birthday party, an event he had been planning with the enthusiasm of someone who believed his existence deserved celebration. He had invited 47 people to the penthouse apartment that he introduced to everyone as his place, never mentioning that the deed was in my name, purchased with my inheritance money under the umbrella of an LLC that I controlled. He had ordered catering from the most expensive service in Chicago, charged to the credit card that I paid off each month from my investment returns. He had hired a photographer to document the evening, wanting evidence of his success and the attractive people who populated his life. What Derek had not planned for was the moment when I would stop performing. My phone buzzed with a text from my attorney, Jennifer Park, who had been helping me prepare for this evening with the thoroughness of someone planning a military campaign. "Everything is ready," her message read. "Documents prepared. Board meeting scheduled for Monday morning. Are you certain you want to proceed?" I typed my response with steady fingers. Absolutely certain. The truth was that I had been certain for a long time, probably since the morning 8 months ago when I had overheard Derek on a phone call with his best friend, Marcus. I had been in the bedroom folding laundry, a domestic task that Derek never acknowledged as labor, and his voice had carried through the apartment with the careless volume of someone who believed he was alone. "She's fine for now," he had said, his tone dismissive in a way that made my hand still on the shirt I was folding. "But you know how it is. Once the business really takes off, I'll need someone who can actually contribute to my success. Someone who understands what I'm building. Right now she's just someone to come home to, but that's not going to be enough long term." I had stood frozen in that bedroom, holding Derek's shirt, listening to him casually discuss my inadequacy with someone else. The betrayal was not that he had doubts about our relationship. The betrayal was that he had built his entire self-concept on foundations I had provided while simultaneously dismissing me as someone who contributed nothing to his success. The betrayal was that I had made myself invisible so completely that he genuinely believed I was. That conversation had been the catalyst for tonight. For the moment that was now less than 10 hours away, when Derek would learn exactly who had been building his life while he took bows for the architecture. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I spent the morning reviewing documents and making final preparations. At 11, I drove to the office building in the Loop where Catalyst Ventures maintained its headquarters. The receptionist greeted me as Ms. Chan, and I spent 2 hours in meetings with my investment team, reviewing the portfolio performance and discussing strategies for the upcoming quarter. My colleagues knew me as decisive, analytical, and uncompromising in my standards. They had no idea that I went home each night to play the role of accommodating girlfriend to a man who thought business strategy was beyond my comprehension. At 2 in the afternoon, I returned to the penthouse to begin preparing for the party. The caterers would arrive at 5 to set up. Guests would begin arriving at 7. Derek planned to make a toast at 8, something he had mentioned to me 3 times in the past week, clearly excited about whatever he intended to say. I suspected the toast would involve some story about his journey to success, carefully edited to remove any reference to assistance or support or the infrastructure that had made his opportunities possible. I selected my outfit with the same care I had used to prepare Derek's breakfast. A black dress, simple and elegant, purchased from a designer boutique using my own money rather than charging it to the account Derek believed funded my wardrobe. Diamond earrings that had belonged to my grandmother, the woman who had left me the inheritance that made everything possible. And my grandmother's watch, a vintage Cartier that she had worn every day of her professional life, as one of the first female executives at a major Chicago corporation in the 1970s. She had given it to me before she died, holding my hand and telling me to never make myself small for any man, to never apologize for my intelligence or capability, to never accept being treated as less than I was. I had broken that promise for 4 years. Tonight I would start keeping it again. Derek arrived home at 6:15, earlier than his usual time but later than he had promised when he said he would be home by 5 to help set up. He swept into the apartment with the energy of someone who was the star of his own movie, immediately critiquing the caterer's placement of the bar and repositioning furniture to better facilitate the mingling he anticipated. He did not ask if I needed help or acknowledge that I had spent the afternoon managing every detail of the event. He would take credit for hosting. "This is going to be perfect," he said, surveying the apartment with satisfaction. "Everyone who matters is coming tonight. I heard that James Thornton might stop by, and if I can get 5 minutes with him, it could completely change the trajectory of the business." James Thornton was a senior partner at one of Chicago's most prestigious private equity firms. What Derek did not know was that James and I had been in discussion for the past 3 months about a potential collaboration between his firm and Catalyst Ventures. James knew exactly who I was and what I controlled. When he arrived tonight and met Derek's girlfriend, It was going to be an interesting moment. But that was still hours away. First, there would be arrivals and small talk and the careful dance of people performing their social status for each other. There would be Derek holding court, telling stories and accepting compliments and building the mythology of his self-made success. There would be his mother, Patricia, who had never approved of me because I did not come from money. Her definition of an appropriate partner for her son being someone whose family name appeared on buildings or charitable foundations. And then there would be the moment. The moment I had been planning for 6 months and preparing for over 4 years. The moment when Derek's carefully constructed reality would collapse and everyone in that room would see both of us clearly for the first time. Guests began arriving at 7:05. I stood near the entrance, greeting people with the warm but slightly reserved manner that Derek had coached me to adopt. "You don't want to be too friendly," he had explained years ago. "It makes you seem desperate for approval. Just be pleasant but not overly invested in making connections. Let people come to you." What he meant, though he would never say it directly, was that I should not embarrass him by trying too hard to fit into his world. I should be present but not prominent, attractive but not attention-seeking, agreeable but not interesting enough to compete with him for focus. I watched him work the room with practiced ease, moving from group to group, laughing at jokes and making observations that others received with the kind of enthusiasm people show when they believe someone might be useful to their advancement. His best friend Marcus arrived with his new girlfriend, a woman I had never met who Marcus introduced as a consultant he had been seeing for 3 months. Derek's business partner, Ryan, came with his wife, Jennifer, who gave me a sympathetic smile that suggested she recognized the dynamic between Derek and me, and felt sorry for my position in it. But the most interesting arrival was Patricia, Derek's mother, who swept into the apartment at 7:45 wearing diamonds and judgment in equal measure. She embraced her son with effusive praise for the beautiful party, then turned to me with the cool assessment of someone examining produce at a market. "The apartment looks lovely," she said, her tone suggesting surprise that I had managed competence in something. "Derek has such wonderful taste." I smiled the smile I had perfected over 4 years. "He certainly does," I agreed, choosing not to mention that every piece of furniture, every light fixture, every carefully selected piece of art had been researched, sourced, and purchased by me, then presented to Derek as options he could take credit for selecting. At 7:55, Derek clinked his glass with a knife to get everyone's attention. The room quieted as 47 people turned toward him, ready to celebrate and affirm his importance in their lives. He stood near the windows overlooking the lake, backlit by the city lights, looking every bit the successful young entrepreneur that he presented himself to be. "I want to thank you all for being here tonight," he began, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of someone who had rehearsed these remarks. 32 years old, and I have to say life is pretty damn good." Laughter and applause rippled through the room. Derek smiled, soaking in the approval, then continued. "When I started my business 4 years ago, people told me I was crazy. They said the market was too competitive, that I didn't have enough experience, that I should play it safe and work for someone else. But I believed in myself. I knew that with the right vision and enough determination, I could build something significant." I stood near the back of the room, watching him rewrite history in real time. There was no mention of the funding that had appeared at exactly the right moment. No acknowledgement of the connections that had been facilitated through intermediaries he never questioned. No recognition of the countless hours of behind-the-scenes work that had cleared obstacles from his path. "And now, 4 years later, we're about to close our biggest deal yet," Derek continued, his confidence building with each sentence. "The Henderson merger is going to triple our revenue and establish us as major players in this market. It's been a long journey, but this is just the beginning." More applause. Marcus whistled. Patricia beamed with maternal pride. "I couldn't have done this alone, of course," Derek said, and for a moment I thought he might actually acknowledge my contribution. "My team has been incredible. Ryan, my partner, has been with me since day one. My mentors have provided invaluable guidance. And my mother has always believed in me, even when things were uncertain." He raised his glass toward Patricia, who accepted the tribute with gracious satisfaction. "And of course," Derek added, almost as an afterthought, "my girlfriend Natalie has been very supportive. It's nice to come home to someone who doesn't stress me out with a bunch of career drama. She keeps things simple, And that's exactly what I need. The room laughed politely at what Derek clearly intended as a compliment. I felt the familiar burn of being reduced to my most basic function in his life, the woman who made things simple by having no ambitions or complications that might interfere with his narrative. Marcus chose that moment to shout from across the room, his voice carrying the edge of too much champagne and too little judgment. "Come on, Derek. Tell them what you told me last week." Derek grinned, the smile of someone about to deliver a punchline he knew would land well with this audience. "What's that, Marcus?" "About your philosophy on relationships. About how successful men need to keep their options open." The room went very still. I watched Derek's face, saw the brief flicker of calculation as he decided whether to go forward with whatever he had discussed with Marcus in private. The champagne and the attention and the applause from his toast pushed him toward recklessness. "Well," Derek said, his tone becoming conspiratorial, inviting everyone into an exclusive understanding, "I do believe that a man at my level has certain realities to face. The truth is, when you're building something significant, you need a partner who understands that your time and attention are valuable. And honestly, someone at my stage of success has options. I could date any woman I wanted, do whatever I pleased, and frankly, I have the right to those choices because I've earned them." He gestured toward me with his champagne glass, his smile suggesting that what he was about to say was both generous and obvious. "Natalie is lucky to be with someone who could have anyone but chooses to come home to her. And she's smart enough to understand that this is a good situation for her. She gets to live in this apartment, drive the car, enjoy the lifestyle, and all she has to do is not complicate my life. That's a pretty good deal if you ask me." The silence that followed was broken by nervous laughter from some guests and uncomfortable shifting from others. Marcus raised his glass enthusiastically, apparently thinking this was brilliant. Patricia nodded approvingly, as if Derek had articulated a fundamental truth about how the world should operate. Ryan looked at the floor, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to challenge his business partner. And I felt something inside me that had been bent for 4 years finally snap straight. I set down my champagne glass with deliberate precision. The small sound of crystal meeting marble carried in the sudden quiet, drawing attention to my movement. Derek was still smiling, riding the high of his pronouncement, when I took 3 steps forward so that I was visible to everyone in the room. "That's interesting, Derek," I said, my voice calm and clear. "You believe you have the right to date any woman and do anything you please because you've earned it through your success." He looked at me with mild surprise, unused to me speaking up during his performances. "That's right," he confirmed, doubling down. "That's just reality. Successful men have options." I smiled then. Not the accommodating smile I had perfected over 4 years, but something sharper and more genuine. "I have a question for you," I said. "How does it feel to know that the apartment you're standing in belongs to me? That the car you drive is titled in my name? That the business you're so proud of building from nothing was funded entirely by my money through a shell company I control? That every single thing you think makes you successful was purchased with my inheritance and managed through my investment portfolio?" The champagne glass slipped from Derek's hand. It hit the hardwood floor and shattered, golden liquid spreading across the polished surface, fragments of crystal scattering like his fragmenting confidence. The room had gone absolutely silent. Every person stood frozen, trying to process what they had just heard. And I was just getting started. The silence in that penthouse apartment stretched for what felt like minutes but was probably only seconds. 47 people stood motionless, their champagne glasses frozen mid-air, their conversations abandoned, their attention fixed entirely on the woman who had just shattered their host's reality with a single paragraph of truth. Derek's face cycled through expressions too quickly to catalog. Confusion gave way to disbelief, disbelief to dawning horror, horror to a desperate attempt at recovery that manifested as forced laughter. He looked around the room seeking allies, finding only shocked faces and averted eyes. "That's not funny, Natalie," he said, his voice lacking the confidence that had characterized every word he had spoken minutes earlier. "This isn't the time for jokes." I walked slowly toward the windows where he stood, my heels clicking against the hardwood floor that I had selected and paid for during the renovation 3 years ago. Each step felt like shedding layers of performance, becoming more solid and visible with every movement away from the shadows where I had lived for 4 years. "I am not joking, Derek. The deed to this apartment is held by North Shore Properties LLC, a company I established in 2020 using a portion of my grandmother's inheritance. The Tesla in the garage downstairs is titled to the same LLC. Your business received its seed funding of $1.2 million from Catalyst Ventures, which is my private equity vehicle operating under my mother's maiden name. Every month for the past 4 years, your company has paid management fees to Catalyst Ventures, which means you have been literally paying me to fund your own success while telling everyone you built this from nothing. Patricia made a small choking sound. Ryan's wife Jennifer had her hand over her mouth. Marcus looked like he was trying to calculate whether this revelation affected his own relationship with Derek, and deciding that it probably did. Derek's hand reached out toward the wall as if he needed physical support. That's impossible. I would have known. The lawyers, the documents, the bank statements. The lawyers work for firms I selected and paid. The documents were structured specifically to obscure my involvement, while maintaining complete legal control. The bank statements for your business account show deposits from Catalyst Ventures, which you never questioned because you assumed they were standard venture capital transactions. You never asked who controlled Catalyst. You never researched the ownership structure. You never wondered why this particular firm was willing to take a chance on an unproven entrepreneur with no track record and no collateral. I turned to address the room, making eye contact with guests who had spent the evening treating me as Derek's pleasant but inconsequential accessory. The reason is simple. I believed in the business concept Derek presented. I thought that with proper funding and support it could succeed. What I did not account for was that he would take credit for every aspect of that success while simultaneously treating me like I contributed nothing to his life except simplicity and lack of drama. James Thornton stepped forward from where he had been standing near the bar. His presence commanded immediate attention, the kind of authority that comes from decades of wielding significant financial power. "Miss Chun," he said, using the name I operated under professionally, "I had no idea you were also Derek's partner in his personal life. This is an unexpected development." The room's attention swiveled between James and me, confusion multiplying as people tried to reconcile the successful investor James was addressing with the quiet girlfriend they had been ignoring all evening. "Mr. Thornton and I have been in discussions about a potential collaboration between Catalyst Ventures and his firm," I explained, watching Derek's face as this information registered. "We have been meeting monthly for the past 3 months to explore investment opportunities and strategic partnerships. Derek, I believe you mentioned earlier that getting 5 minutes with James Thornton could change the trajectory of your business. You have been sleeping next to someone who has been having extended business meetings with him, and you never once thought to ask about my schedule or my professional activities." Derek opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. No words emerged. He looked like a man watching his own life collapse in real time, unable to stop the destruction or even fully comprehend its scope. I had not planned to reveal all of this tonight. My original intention was simply to announce that I owned the apartment and the car, to make it clear that his claims about my dependence on him were precisely inverted from reality. But standing in that room, watching him struggle to process the first layer of truth, I found that years of suppressed honesty were pouring out like water from a broken dam. "Let me tell you all a story," I said, my voice carrying to every corner of the apartment. "Let me tell you how we got here because I think context matters." I walked to the couch and sat down, my posture relaxed despite the tension crackling through the room. People shifted awkwardly, uncertain whether they should leave or stay, ultimately deciding that staying was the only way to understand what was happening. My grandmother, Catherine Chun, came to Chicago from Taiwan in 1968 with $200 and a degree in economics from National Taiwan University. She worked as a secretary at a manufacturing company during the day and took graduate courses at night, eventually earning her MBA from the University of Chicago. By 1975, she had worked her way into a junior analyst position. By 1985, she was a vice president. By 1995, she was the chief financial officer. When she retired in 2010, she was one of the most respected financial minds in this city. I paused, letting them absorb this information about the woman whose inheritance had funded everything Derek claimed as his own achievement. She built a substantial portfolio during her career, investing carefully and strategically, never taking unnecessary risks but never being afraid to bet on ideas she believed in. When she died in 2019, she left me $2 million with explicit instructions in her will. She told me to use that money to build my own independence, to never rely on any man for my financial security, to make myself powerful enough that I could never be dismissed or diminished by anyone. Patricia had sat down abruptly on one of the dining chairs, her face pale beneath her carefully applied makeup. I noticed several other guests pulling out their phones, probably searching for information about Catherine Chan or Catalyst Ventures or North Shore Properties LLC. I met Derek 6 months after my grandmother died. I was 27 years old, grieving someone who had been my mentor and my inspiration, trying to figure out how to honor her legacy and her instructions. Derek was charming and confident and full of ideas about the business he wanted to start. He talked about disrupting the consulting industry, about building a firm that combined traditional strategy work with technology implementation. It was actually a solid concept. I looked directly at Derek, who was still standing by the windows, his birthday party transformed into the trial of his character. What Derek did not know was that I had spent the previous 6 months completing my MBA at Northwestern. He did not know that I had taken every penny of my inheritance and begun building an investment portfolio, working with advisors and learning everything I could about private equity and venture capital. He did not know that when he pitched his business idea to me over dinner one night, I was not just his girlfriend being polite. I was evaluating his concept with the same rigor I applied to any potential investment. Ryan spoke for the first time, his voice cautious. So you decided to fund his company? As an investment? I decided to fund the company because the idea was sound and the market timing was right. I decided to do it secretly because I wanted to see what Derek would do if he believed he had accomplished this on his own. I wanted to know if he would give me credit for anything, acknowledge my support in any way, or if he would construct a narrative where he was the sole architect of his success. The answer to that question was obvious to everyone in the room. For 4 years I have watched Derek tell people that he built his business from nothing. I have listened to him explain strategy concepts to me that I learned in graduate school courses he does not know I took. I have smiled while he introduced me to potential clients and investors as his girlfriend who keeps things simple, never mentioning that I was the reason those meetings were happening in the first place. I have made myself invisible to see how thoroughly he would erase my contributions from his story. Jennifer, Ryan's wife, spoke up quietly. Why did you stay? If he treated you this way, why not just leave? It was a fair question, one I had asked myself countless times over the past 4 years. The answer was complicated, woven from threads of hope and fear and strategic calculation. At first, I stayed because I thought he would eventually see me. I thought that if I was patient, if I supported him through the difficult early stages of building the business, he would recognize what I was providing and treat me as a partner rather than an accessory. I thought love and contribution would be enough to earn respect. The room was silent except for the ambient sounds of the city filtering through the windows, the distant horn of a boat on the lake, the muted traffic from the streets far below. Then I stayed because I was angry. I realized that Derek was never going to acknowledge my role, unless forced to confront it. I realized that I had made myself so invisible that he genuinely believed the story he was telling. And I decided that if I was going to reveal the truth, I wanted to do it in a way that made the contrast undeniable. I wanted him to fully commit to his narrative of self-made success before I showed him that every brick in his foundation had my name on it. Marcus, who had been silent since his earlier outburst about Derek's relationship philosophy, finally found his voice. This is insane. You set him up. You deliberately let him think he was successful on his own just so you could humiliate him later? I turned to face Marcus, this man who had encouraged Derek to share his disrespectful views about relationships, who had laughed the loudest at jokes about my simplicity and lack of professional ambition. I gave Derek every opportunity to see me clearly. I never hid my intelligence or my education. I simply stopped volunteering information after it became clear that he preferred not to know. When he assumed I spent my days shopping and going to yoga classes, I did not correct him because I was curious whether he would ever ask what I actually did with my time. When he explained basic business concepts to me as if they were revelations, I did not mention that I had studied those exact concepts at graduate level because I wanted to see if he would ever wonder about my background or my capabilities. I stood and walked to the bookshelf that lined one wall of the living room. My fingers found the spine I was looking for, A leather-bound portfolio that I had placed there 3 years ago, hidden in plain sight among Derek's collection of business books that he displayed but rarely read. I opened the portfolio and began removing documents, spreading them across the coffee table where everyone could see. The deed to the apartment, the title to the Tesla, the founding documents for Catalyst Ventures showing my ownership, the investment agreement between Catalyst Ventures and Derek's company, with my signature on the final page as managing director. Bank statements showing the flow of money from my inheritance through various investment vehicles into the life Derek thought he had built through his own merit. I did not set Derek up for humiliation, I said, my voice steady and clear. I gave him everything he needed to succeed and stepped back to see if he would acknowledge that support or claim it as his own achievement. He made his choice. Tonight, he stood in an apartment I own, celebrating a business I fund, and announced to everyone here that I was lucky to be with him because he could have anyone he wanted. He said he had the right to date other women and do whatever he pleased because his success had earned him that privilege. He reduced my value in his life to the fact that I keep things simple and do not create drama. Patricia had her face in her hands. Several guests were edging toward the door, clearly wanting to escape the discomfort of this scene but unwilling to miss any additional revelations. Every choice Derek made was his own. Every word he spoke tonight reflected his actual beliefs about my worth and his superiority. I simply created the conditions where his truth would be revealed. And now that we are all clear about what Derek actually thinks, we can talk about what happens next. Derek finally found his voice, though it came out strangled and desperate. Natalie, please. We can talk about this privately. We don't need to do this in front of everyone. I made a mistake. I said things I should not have said. But we can work this out. We can go back to how things were. I looked at him with something approaching pity. He still did not understand. He thought this was about hurt feelings or wounded pride, something that could be smoothed over with apologies and promises. He could not grasp that this was about fundamental truth and the end of performance. We cannot go back, Derek, because we were never actually in the place you thought we were. You were in a relationship with a woman you invented, someone who existed only in your imagination, someone who had no ambitions or capabilities or identity beyond being your supportive girlfriend. That woman was never real. I created her because I wanted to see if you would ever look beneath the surface. You never did. I picked up my phone and opened the email I had prepared 3 days ago, my finger hovering over the send button. On Monday morning, the board of directors of Catalyst Ventures will convene for an emergency meeting. The agenda includes one item, reviewing the continued funding of Derek's company and determining whether Catalyst's investment aligns with our values regarding respect, integrity, and recognition of contributions from all stakeholders. Derek's face went from pale to gray. You cannot pull the funding. The Henderson merger depends on having stable financial backing. If Catalyst withdraws, the deal collapses, and the company will not survive. That is correct, I confirmed. Your business exists because of my money and my strategic support. If I withdraw both, the entire structure collapses. Everything you have built over the past 4 years disappears because it was never actually yours. It was always mine, temporarily loaned to someone I thought might grow into worthiness of the gift. Ryan stepped forward, his expression pleading. Natalie, I understand you are angry with Derek, and honestly he deserves everything you are saying. But there are 12 other employees at the company who did nothing wrong. If you pull the funding, they lose their jobs. Their families suffer. Is that really what you want? It was a legitimate point, one I had considered extensively during my planning. The truth was that I had no intention of destroying the business or harming innocent employees. But Derek did not need to know that yet. What I want, I said carefully, is for Derek to understand that actions have consequences. That treating people as if they are disposable or decorative or lucky to be tolerated has costs. That success built on someone else's invisible labor, and then claimed as entirely your own achievement is not success at all, but theft. I pressed send on the email and my phone made a soft whoosh sound as the message departed to Jennifer Park, my attorney, who would forward it to the other board members of Catalyst Ventures. The board meeting is Monday at 9 in the morning. Between now and then, Derek, I suggest you think carefully about what you actually contributed to your business versus what was provided by others. Think about every meeting that was scheduled by someone else, Every connection that was facilitated through intermediaries you never questioned. Every obstacle that was cleared from your path by work you never witnessed. Think about who you would be and where you would be without the infrastructure that appeared around you so seamlessly that you mistook it for luck or destiny or your own magnetic personality. I walked toward the door, picking up my coat from where I had hung it hours earlier when I had still been playing the role of Derek's accommodating girlfriend. The guests parted to let me through, some looking sympathetic, others appearing calculating as they reassessed their own relationships, and wondering if they had been similarly blind to contributions they took for granted. At the door I turned back one final time. Derek was sitting on the couch now, his head in his hands, his birthday party in ruins around him. Patricia was crying quietly. Her vision of her successful son shattered along with his champagne glass. Marcus had disappeared, probably to the bathroom to hide his own embarrassment at having encouraged Derek's arrogance. Ryan and Jennifer stood together, whispering urgently about damage control and Monday's board meeting. "Happy birthday, Derek," I said softly. "I hope you got what you wanted tonight. You wanted to celebrate your success in front of everyone who mattered to you. You wanted to establish your status and your power, and your right to have whatever you pleased. Congratulations. You got the celebration you planned. You just did not get the ending you expected." I walked out of the apartment I owned, leaving the door open behind me. I could hear the stunned silence giving way to urgent conversations, the sound of my 4-year performance finally, definitively, over. The elevator ride down 42 floors felt like descending from one life into another. When I reached the lobby, the night doorman looked at me with concern. "Miss Chun, are you all right? You are leaving your own party early." He was one of the few people who knew the truth about the apartment's ownership. I had always been kind to the building staff, learning their names and asking about their families, treating them like human beings rather than service providers. Derek barely acknowledged their existence. "I am fine, Marcus," I assured him. "Better than fine, actually. I just did something I should have done a long time ago." I walked out into the Chicago night, the late March air still carrying winter's bite despite the calendar's insistence that spring had arrived. Lake Michigan stretched dark and vast to my right, the city lights reflected on its surface like fallen stars. Behind me, 42 floors up, my former life continued without me, Derek and his guests trying to make sense of a reality that had been true all along but only now become visible. I pulled out my phone and called Jennifer Park. She answered on the first ring, having clearly been waiting for my call. "It is done," I told her. "The revelation is complete. He knows everything." "How did he react?" Jennifer asked, her voice professional but curious. "Exactly as we expected. Disbelief, denial, desperation. He still does not fully comprehend the scope of what was happening behind the scenes while he was taking credit for everything." "And the board meeting Monday?" "Proceed as planned. But Jennifer, make sure the documentation is clear that the 12 employees keep their jobs regardless of what happens with Derek. They did nothing wrong, and I will not punish them for his failures." "Already prepared," Jennifer assured me. "The separation documents remove Derek from any management role, but preserve the company structure and all current employment contracts. They will survive this transition." I ended the call and stood on the sidewalk, watching cars pass and people hurry by on their way to whatever Friday night adventures awaited them. Somewhere above me, my grandmother's watch ticked steadily on my wrist, marking time the way she had throughout her extraordinary life. She had warned me about making myself small. She had told me that silence was sometimes strategic, but should never become permanent. She had left me resources specifically so that I would never be dependent on anyone else's approval or support. For 4 years I had ignored her wisdom, convinced that love and patience would eventually earn me the respect I deserved. Tonight I had finally listened to her voice again, the voice that said my worth was not determined by whether Derek recognized it, that my contributions were valuable regardless of whether he acknowledged them, that I deserved to be seen completely rather than existing as a supporting character in someone else's story. The night was cold, but I felt warm with the heat of truth finally spoken, of performance finally abandoned, of becoming visible after years of living in shadows I had created for myself. Monday would bring difficult conversations and complex decisions about the future of Derek's company and my investment. But tonight, walking alone through downtown Chicago, I was simply a woman who had reclaimed her own story and spoken her own truth. And that felt like the best birthday gift I could have given myself, even if it was Derek's party where I finally unwrapped it. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that only March in Chicago can produce, the sun bright and merciless against a sky so blue it looked artificial. I woke in my hotel suite at the Peninsula, having decided that returning to the penthouse after last night's revelation would be both logistically complicated and symbolically wrong. The apartment might legally belong to me, but emotionally it represented 4 years of performance and suppression. I needed space that carried no history, no expectations, no memories of who I had pretended to be. My phone showed 43 missed calls. 17 from Derek, each voicemail progressing from confused to angry to desperate to something approaching genuine remorse. 9 from Patricia, her messages moving from imperious demands that I call her immediately to explain myself to increasingly uncertain requests that we discuss this situation like reasonable adults. 6 from Marcus, apparently having appointed himself Derek's defender and spokesperson. The remaining calls came from various party guests, some expressing shock and support, others clearly seeking gossip or attempting to assess how this development might affect their own relationships with Derek or their business interests. I ignored all of them and ordered room service: coffee, eggs Benedict, fresh fruit, and the Chicago Tribune. I ate slowly while reading the business section, a luxury I had rarely permitted myself during the years with Derek. He had particular ideas about weekend mornings, specific routines that revolved around his preferences and schedule. The simple act of eating breakfast alone, reading whatever I chose, taking as much time as I wanted felt like a small declaration of independence. My phone rang again at 9:15. Jennifer Park, the only call I was prepared to answer. "Good morning," I said, settling into the chair by the window that overlooked Michigan Avenue. "I assume you have updates." Jennifer's voice carried the brisk efficiency of someone who had been working since dawn. "Multiple developments. First, Derek has retained counsel. Richard Morrison from Barrett and Associates. They sent a letter at 7 this morning threatening litigation if you proceed with removing funding from the company. The argument is that you entered into a contractual relationship with the business and cannot arbitrarily withdraw based on personal grievances." I sipped my coffee, unsurprised by this development. Derek's first instinct when threatened had always been to deploy lawyers and aggressive posturing. The contracts contain explicit provisions allowing Catalyst Ventures to withdraw funding if management demonstrates conduct inconsistent with the firm's values, or if circumstances change that materially affect the investment thesis. Derek's public statements last night about his right to date anyone and do whatever he pleases while in a committed relationship constitute conduct issues. His complete unawareness of his own company's funding structure represents a material competence concern. "That is precisely what I told Morrison when he called me 30 minutes ago," Jennifer confirmed. "He was not pleased. He suggested we were manufacturing justifications for what amounts to a personal vendetta. I informed him that we would be happy to present our concerns to a judge if he would like to pursue litigation, and that discovery would be quite illuminating regarding who funded what and when." I smiled despite the seriousness of the conversation. Jennifer was exceptionally good at her job, which was one of many reasons I had retained her firm when establishing Catalyst Ventures. "What else?" "Patricia called my office 4 times before 8 this morning. She wants to meet with you privately." She used the phrase woman to woman 3 times in her message. She believes this situation can be resolved through what she called a mature conversation between adults who understand how the world actually works. The presumption in Patricia's request was almost admirable in its audacity. She had spent 4 years treating me as an unsuitable match for her son, someone who lacked the proper breeding and connections to be a true asset to Derek's advancement. She had made her disapproval clear through countless small cuts, the way she introduced me to her friends with apologetic explanations, the manner in which she discussed Derek's future in my presence as if I would naturally not be part of it, her habit of suggesting that Derek needed someone who could open doors for him professionally. "Patricia does not want a mature conversation," I said. "She wants to determine whether I can be managed, placated, or intimidated into maintaining the status quo. She wants to assess my vulnerabilities and exploit them in service of protecting Derek from consequences." "That would be my assessment as well," Jennifer agreed. "However, Meeting with her might provide useful information about their strategy and their understanding of your position. You would control the setting and the terms. I could be present if you would like. I considered this proposal while watching people move along Michigan Avenue far below, everyone occupied with their Saturday errands and plans, oblivious to the small drama playing out in a hotel suite above them. Patricia was a formidable woman in her own right, someone who had built significant social capital over decades of careful relationship cultivation. She understood power and how to wield it within certain contexts. But her power came from traditional structures, from knowing the right people and understanding unspoken social rules. She had no experience with someone like me, someone who had built power quietly and strategically in ways she would never think to look for. Set up a meeting for this afternoon, I decided. 2:00 at the hotel restaurant downstairs. Public enough that she cannot become too aggressive, private enough for honest conversation. You do not need to be present but have your phone on. If the meeting goes longer than an hour, call me with a fictitious emergency. After Jennifer ended the call to make arrangements, I returned my attention to the missed voicemails. I selected one from Marcus, curious about what approach he would take given his role in encouraging Derek's disastrous birthday speech. His voice on the recording carried aggressive defensiveness. Natalie, I do not know what game you think you are playing, but you need to understand something. Derek is a good guy who made some comments that maybe came out wrong because he had too much champagne. You are blowing this completely out of proportion and trying to destroy him because you are insecure about the relationship. If you actually cared about him, you would be supportive instead of vindictive. You need to call off this board meeting and stop threatening his business. If you do not, everyone is going to see you for what you really are, which is a manipulative person who has been lying to all of us for years. Call me back so we can talk about this reasonably. The message revealed everything important about Marcus. He had completely missed the substance of last night's revelation, focusing instead on the champagne-fueled comments as if they were the core issue rather than merely the catalyst. He had reframed the situation entirely around my supposed insecurity and vindictiveness, erasing Derek's behavior and his own encouragement of that behavior from the narrative. He had threatened social consequences if I proceeded with accountability, assuming that fear of others' judgment would be sufficient to make me retreat. Marcus represented a particular type of enabler, someone whose own position and worldview depended on maintaining existing power structures. He benefited from a system where successful men could treat their partners as accessories, where public disrespect of women was reframed as jokes or champagne-induced mistakes, where any woman who demanded equal treatment was characterized as emotional or manipulative. Challenging Derek threatened that entire framework, which meant Marcus would fight viciously to restore the previous order. I deleted his message without responding and moved to one from Ryan, Derek's business partner. His voice sounded exhausted and worried. Natalie, it is Ryan. I am trying to understand what happened last night and what it means for the company. I know Derek said things he should not have said. I know he has not treated you the way he should have. But I am hoping we can find some way to separate the personal issues from the business considerations. There are 12 people counting on this company for their livelihoods. I am one of them. My wife is pregnant with our second child. I cannot afford to lose everything because Derek was an idiot at his birthday party. Please call me. I am not trying to defend him. I just want to understand what you need from us going forward. Ryan's message struck a different note. He was not denying Derek's behavior or trying to minimize its significance. He was acknowledging fault while asking for mercy on behalf of people who had done nothing wrong. His appeal was practical rather than moral, focused on tangible consequences rather than abstract principles. I made a note to call Ryan later in the day. He deserved a conversation, and unlike Marcus or Patricia, he seemed capable of hearing truth without immediately trying to reshape it into something more comfortable. The final voicemail I selected was from Derek himself, time-stamped at 3:47 in the morning. His voice was raw and defeated. Natalie, I cannot sleep. I have been sitting here trying to understand how I missed this. How I missed you. I keep thinking about conversations we had, things you said that I did not really hear because I was too focused on my own agenda. I remember you mentioning that you study business, and I made some joke about how business school probably was not that challenging. I remember you offering suggestions about company strategy, and I dismissed them because I thought you were just trying to be helpful without really understanding the complexities. I remember introducing you to investors as my girlfriend, never thinking to mention that you might have professional credibility in your own right." There was a long pause filled with ambient noise, the sound of wind against windows, the distant hum of the city that never entirely sleeps. "I am not calling to ask you to forgive me or to change your mind about the board meeting. I do not have the right to ask you for anything. I am calling because I need you to know that I finally see it. I finally see how thoroughly I erased you while believing I was building something meaningful. I built it with your money and your strategy and your invisible work, and I told everyone including myself that I did it alone. That is not a mistake you make because you drank too much champagne. That is who I apparently am when nobody is forcing me to be better." Another pause, longer this time. "My mom wants to meet with you. Marcus is telling me to fight this legally. Ryan is worried about the employees. Everyone has an opinion about what I should do. But the truth is that I do not know what to do because I do not actually know how to function in reality. I have been living in a fantasy where I was the hero of my own story, and you just showed me that I was actually a supporting character in yours. I do not know how to process that. I do not know how to be the person who existed entirely because someone else allowed it." The message ended without any request for callback or suggestion of next steps. It simply stopped, as if Derek had run out of things to say or energy to say them. I sat with that voicemail for a long time, replaying it twice to make sure I had heard correctly. There was something in Derek's voice that I had never heard before. A quality of genuine self-recognition that went beyond the performative remorse people often express when caught behaving badly. He sounded like someone who had looked in a mirror and not recognized the reflection. Someone forced to confront distance between his self-concept and his actual character. The question was whether that recognition would translate into actual change, or merely represent another phase of performance, a strategic display of humility, designed to manipulate me into restoring the previous arrangement. At 1:45, I dressed carefully for my meeting with Patricia. I selected a navy suit from Armani, professional and expensive without being ostentatious. My grandmother's watch on my left wrist, small diamond studs in my ears, gifts from my father when I graduated from college. I wanted Patricia to see me as I actually was, as a woman of substance and capability, not as the person she had decided I was based on her own assumptions and prejudices. The hotel restaurant was moderately busy with the lunch crowd beginning to thin. Patricia was already seated at a corner table when I arrived, precisely on time. She had dressed with equal care in a cream-colored suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, her jewelry understated but clearly valuable, her posture perfect and her expression carefully controlled. "Thank you for meeting with me," she said as I sat down, her tone suggesting that my agreement to meet represented a small victory she intended to build upon. "I think this situation has gotten away from all of us, and it is time for cooler heads to prevail." I ordered sparkling water from the server and turned my full attention to Patricia. "What situation are you referring to? The situation where your son publicly announced that he has the right to date any woman and do whatever he pleases because he is successful? Or the situation where he has spent 4 years taking credit for a business built entirely on my financial backing and strategic support?" Patricia's composure flickered briefly before reasserting itself. "Derek made some inappropriate comments under the influence of alcohol. He has acknowledged that and is prepared to apologize. But the response you have chosen is disproportionate to the offense. Threatening to destroy his business because he said something foolish at a party is vindictive and ultimately self-defeating." "I am not threatening to destroy his business because he said something foolish," I corrected. "I am reassessing my investment in a company run by someone who demonstrated profound lack of judgment, self-awareness, and basic respect for the people who support him. Those are legitimate business concerns that any investor would consider carefully." Patricia leaned forward slightly, her voice taking on a confidential quality meant to establish intimacy and shared understanding. "Natalie, I am going to be direct with you because I think you are intelligent enough to appreciate directness. You have made your point. You have demonstrated that you have resources Derek was not aware of. You have embarrassed him in front of his friends and colleagues. You have asserted your power in the relationship. That is all well and good. But now it is time to think strategically about what you actually want." She paused to sip her own water, gathering her thoughts or perhaps simply creating dramatic tension. "If you destroy Derek's business, You destroy your own investment. You lose money and gain nothing except the satisfaction of revenge, which is a poor return on investment by any measure. If you end the relationship, you walk away from 4 years of building a life together. And at your age, starting over is not simple. The dating market for women in their 30s is considerably more challenging than you might imagine. The casual condescension in her assessment of my age and prospects was remarkable in its transparency. Patricia genuinely believed that fear of being alone would be sufficient leverage to make me accept continued mistreatment. What I am suggesting, Patricia continued, is that we find a path forward that allows everyone to preserve what they have built. Derek apologizes sincerely and publicly. Perhaps you take a more visible role in the business, something that allows you to receive appropriate credit for your contributions. The two of you work with a counselor to improve communication. In exchange, you maintain the funding and you stop threatening to expose private business arrangements that were structured the way they were for legitimate reasons. I let the silence stretch between us while I considered how to respond to this negotiation that Patricia clearly thought was reasonable. She had revealed her entire hand without realizing it. She believed that I wanted primarily to be seen and acknowledged, that my objections could be satisfied with superficial changes that left fundamental power structures intact. She thought this was about recognition and respect rather than about refusing to participate in my own diminishment. Patricia, let me be equally direct with you. Derek did not make inappropriate comments under the influence of alcohol. He revealed his actual beliefs about our relationship and my value in his life. The alcohol simply removed the filter that normally prevents people from speaking their truth publicly. What he said represents what he actually thinks. What he actually thinks is that I am lucky to be with him, and that he has earned the right through his success to treat me as disposable or replaceable. Patricia started to interrupt, but I continued without pause. The fact that you characterize his statements as foolish rather than cruel, as inappropriate rather than disqualifying, tells me everything I need to know about your values and your understanding of what constitutes acceptable behavior. You are not concerned that your son disrespected his partner publicly. You are concerned that his disrespect was revealed, and that revelation has created consequences for him. I leaned back in my chair, my posture relaxed despite the tension of the conversation. You mentioned that I have made my point and demonstrated my power. You suggested that the appropriate response now is to restore the previous arrangement with superficial modifications. But I did not reveal the truth about my role in Derek's life, in order to negotiate for slightly better treatment, within the same fundamentally broken dynamic. I revealed the truth because I am done participating in that dynamic entirely. Patricia's expression hardened, the veneer of maternal concern giving way to something colder and more calculating. You are making a serious mistake. Derek has significant support within the Chicago business community. People who matter have been watching his success and are invested in seeing him continue to rise. If you attempt to undermine him, you will find that reputation matters in this city. Your investment firm may be successful now, but success depends on relationships and trust. Nobody wants to work with someone who is known for destroying their partners out of spite. The threat was explicit now, no longer wrapped in concern or appeals to shared interests. Patricia was informing me that she would deploy her social capital and connections to damage my professional reputation if I proceeded with holding Derek accountable. She would tell everyone that I was vindictive, manipulative, unstable. She would characterize me as someone who had trapped Derek by hiding my wealth, and then use that hidden power to control and ultimately destroy him. She would craft a narrative where I was the villain and Derek was the victim of my deception and cruelty. Let me tell you what I think will happen if you attempt that strategy, I said calmly. You will discover that my professional reputation is built on actual achievement and relationships with people who have worked with me directly. James Thornton, who you may know as one of the most respected investors in this city, has been in business discussions with me for months. He will tell people that I am competent, strategic, and principled. The other investors and entrepreneurs I have worked with through Catalyst Ventures will confirm that I am fair, thorough, and reliable. I signaled the server for more water, taking my time before continuing. You will also discover that many people in the Chicago business community are tired of men like Derek who take credit for others' work while treating their supporters as disposable. Many women have experienced exactly what I experienced, being erased and dismissed, while watching men build careers on their invisible contributions. Many men are embarrassed by the Derek Williamses of the world and will not rush to defend him. The narrative you want to create, where I am the unreasonable woman punishing a man for minor mistakes, will compete with an alternative narrative where a talented investor finally stopped enabling someone who took her for granted. Patricia was quiet now, reassessing her approach as she recognized that threats of social consequences were not having the intended effect. She set down her water glass with precise care, her movements controlled and deliberate. What do you want, Natalie? At the end of all this posturing and positioning, what is the actual outcome you are seeking? It was a fair question, one that deserved a thoughtful answer. I had spent weeks considering exactly this question, trying to separate what I wanted from what I thought I should want, distinguishing between justice and revenge, between accountability and cruelty. I want Derek to understand that his success was not inevitable or solely his creation. I want him to recognize the contributions he dismissed and the person he failed to see. I want him to face actual consequences for behavior that was not minor or champagne-induced, but rather reflective of his core values and assumptions. I want the people who enabled and encouraged his disrespect to acknowledge their role in creating the conditions where last night's disaster felt appropriate to him. I met Patricia's eyes directly, holding her gaze without aggression but also without submission or apology. And I want everyone who watched me be invisible for 4 years to understand that invisibility was a choice I made, not a condition imposed on me by lack of capability or worth. I want the truth to be clear so that nobody mistakes silence for absence or accommodation for agreement. Patricia absorbed this, her expression revealing nothing about whether she understood or accepted what I was saying. Finally, she spoke, her voice carrying less certainty than it had at the beginning of our conversation. And the business? The employees who have done nothing wrong but will suffer if you withdraw funding? The business will survive, I said. The employees will keep their jobs. But Derek will not. He will be removed from any management role, and his equity will be restructured to reflect the actual value he contributed versus the value he claimed. Ryan can run the company or we can bring in outside management. But Derek's time benefiting from my invisible support while taking credit for my contributions is finished. Patricia stood abruptly, gathering her purse with movements that suggested this conversation was over. You are going to regret this. Whatever you think you are accomplishing by humiliating my son, you are actually destroying your own future. Nobody respects a woman who cannot maintain a relationship. Nobody trusts someone who hides who they are, and then uses that deception as a weapon. I remained seated, looking up at her with something approaching sympathy for someone so invested in a worldview that reality was actively contradicting. Patricia, I did not hide who I was. I simply stopped performing for people who were not paying attention. Your son could have asked me about my background, my education, my professional activities at any point during 4 years. He chose not to because knowing the truth would have complicated his narrative about himself. That was his choice, not my deception. She left without responding, her departure marked by rigid posture and controlled fury. I sat alone at the table for a few minutes longer, finishing my water and reflecting on how thoroughly Patricia had revealed the shape of Derek's defense. She would frame this as my overreaction and his victim status. She would deploy social pressure and professional threats. She would appeal to traditional gender dynamics and age-based fears. And when none of that worked, she would simply attack my character and credibility wherever possible. It was exactly what I had expected, which was why I had prepared for it extensively. The board meeting Monday would proceed as planned. Derek would face consequences proportionate to his behavior. And Patricia would discover that her son's situation was not something she could manage or control through the social mechanisms that had worked for her throughout her life. I returned to my hotel suite and called Ryan to have the conversation he deserved. He answered immediately, his relief at hearing from me evident in his voice. "Thank you for calling back," he said. "I was not sure you would. You asked reasonable questions and expressed legitimate concerns," I replied. "You deserve answers. The employees will be fine. Their positions are secure, and their contracts will be honored. The board meeting Monday is specifically about Derek's role, not about the viability of the company." The sound of Ryan exhaling suggested he had been holding tension since last night. "And Derek? What happens to him?" "That depends on Derek. If he accepts accountability and steps aside from management, There is a path forward where he retains some equity and eventually might have some advisory role. If he fights this and tries to claim victim status or dispute the fundamental facts, then the separation will be more complete and more costly for him. Ryan was quiet for a moment before speaking carefully. I have known Derek for 6 years. We started the company together. I thought I knew him well. But watching what happened last night, hearing how he talked about you, learning that he had no idea where the funding came from or who was actually making things happen behind the scenes, I realized I did not know him at all. Or maybe I knew him but did not want to see him clearly. That happens with people we care about, I said. We see the version we want to exist rather than the version that actually does. The question I keep asking myself, Ryan continued, is whether I enabled this. Whether I should have said something when he was dismissive of you or when he took credit for things I knew other people had done. I told myself it was not my place to interfere in your relationship or to challenge how he ran the business. But maybe silence when you see something wrong is the same as approval. It was the kind of self-examination that few people engaged in, the willingness to look at one's own complicity rather than simply condemning others' more obvious failures. You can answer that question going forward, I told him. You can decide what kind of partner and colleague you want to be from this point on. Monday's board meeting will create an opportunity for the company to establish new values and new culture. You can be part of building something better. After we ended the call, I spent the rest of the afternoon reviewing documents Jennifer had prepared for Monday's board meeting. The case was straightforward and well documented. Derek had no viable defense against the facts. The only question was how much damage he would inflict on himself and others while refusing to accept what was already inevitable. As sunset painted the sky outside my hotel windows in shades of orange and purple, I thought about Patricia's warning that nobody respects a woman who cannot maintain a relationship. The premise beneath that warning was that maintaining a relationship was inherently valuable regardless of the relationship's quality or the cost of maintaining it. The assumption was that being alone represented failure while being partnered represented success, even if that partnership required making yourself invisible and accepting mistreatment. My grandmother had spent the last 15 years of her life happily single after divorcing a husband who had expected her to abandon her career when they married. She had told me that the divorce was the best decision she ever made because it freed her to become fully herself without negotiating or compromising or performing for someone else's comfort. She had built her greatest professional achievements during those 15 years, mentored dozens of young women and men, traveled extensively, and lived precisely as she chose without apology or explanation. I understood now what she had been trying to teach me, that being seen fully was worth more than being loved partially. That respect was not something you earned through accommodation but something you insisted upon through boundaries. That power held in secret was not really power at all, just another form of making yourself small enough to fit into spaces that were never designed for you. Monday morning would bring difficult conversations and uncomfortable truths. But tonight, alone in a hotel suite overlooking a city full of possibility, I felt more powerful than I had in 4 years of living in a penthouse apartment that I owned but Derek claimed as his achievement. I felt visible in a way that had nothing to do with whether anyone else was looking and everything to do with knowing exactly who I was and refusing to pretend otherwise. The phone rang one more time before I went to sleep. Derek again, leaving another voicemail I would listen to eventually but not tonight. Tonight was for rest and preparation. Tomorrow would be for the next phase of becoming someone who no longer required anyone else's permission to exist fully in her own life. Sunday morning brought rain. The kind of persistent March precipitation that transformed Chicago into a study in gray tones and reflected light. I woke early despite having stayed up past midnight reviewing financial projections and legal documents, my mind too active for proper rest. The hotel suite felt simultaneously like sanctuary and holding pattern, a space between identities where I was neither the invisible girlfriend I had been nor fully the person I was becoming. Jennifer had sent an email at 6 in the morning with the subject line, Sunday Developments. I opened it while drinking coffee and watching rain streak down the windows, the city below shrouded in mist that made even familiar landmarks appear mysterious and transformed. The email contained 3 attachments and a brief summary. Derek had retained additional counsel, bringing in Thomas Brennan from one of Chicago's most aggressive litigation firms. Brennan specialized in high-stakes business disputes and had a reputation for scorched earth tactics. His involvement signaled that Derek had moved beyond hoping for reconciliation and into full defensive mode. The second attachment showed that Marcus had posted on social media a carefully worded statement about supporting friends during difficult times and the importance of not rushing to judgment based on incomplete information. The post had generated significant engagement, with people I had met at various social functions weighing in with opinions about situations they knew nothing about beyond what Marcus had chosen to share. The third attachment was most interesting. Someone, presumably Derek or someone acting on his behalf, had leaked a version of Friday night's events to a local business blogger who specialized in startup drama and founder conflicts. The blog post, published at 11 the previous night, framed the situation as a cautionary tale about mixing business and personal relationships. It suggested that an unnamed investor had secretly funded an unnamed entrepreneur's company while in a romantic relationship, then threatened to withdraw funding after a relationship dispute. The post questioned the ethics of secret investment relationships and speculated about whether this represented manipulation or even entrapment. I read the blog post twice, noting its careful construction. It never mentioned names, avoiding potential legal issues while including enough details that anyone who had attended Friday's party would recognize the situation. It positioned Derek as a naive entrepreneur who had been deceived by someone pretending to be something other than what they were. It raised questions about my motives and methods, while treating Derek's behavior as understandable reactions to discovering he had been manipulated. The narrative warfare had begun exactly as I had anticipated. Patricia and Derek were deploying every available resource to reframe the situation before Monday's board meeting. They understood that controlling the story was as important as controlling the facts, perhaps more so in certain contexts. If they could establish a narrative where I was the deceptive manipulator and Derek was the betrayed victim, they might generate enough social and professional pressure to make me reconsider holding him accountable. I forwarded the blog post to Jennifer with a single line of response. Proceed with Monday's agenda as planned. This changes nothing. My phone rang moments later. Jennifer's voice carried the tension of someone who had been anticipating a different reaction. You are not concerned about the blog post? It is already being shared widely within Chicago business circles. By Monday morning, this version of events will have significant circulation. Let them tell their version, I said calmly. The board meeting will present facts and documentation. People can believe Marcus's social media posts and anonymous blog gossip, or they can look at contracts, bank transfers, and 4 years of funding history. I am not going to fight a public relations battle when I have already won the substantive argument. Jennifer was quiet for a moment before responding. You are remarkably calm for someone who is being characterized as manipulative and unethical by people with significant platforms and influence. I learned something from my grandmother, I replied, watching rain create patterns on the window glass. She told me that people who need to lie about you are revealing their own weaknesses, not exposing yours. The truth is documented and verifiable. Derek had no idea where his funding came from because he never asked. I did not hide my education or my professional activities. I simply stopped volunteering information after it became clear nobody was interested. Those are facts. Everything else is narrative construction designed to avoid accountability. After we ended the call, I spent the morning reviewing my grandmother's journals, leather-bound volumes she had kept throughout her professional life. I had inherited them along with her financial assets, but I had not read them carefully until recently. They contained observations about business strategy and investment philosophy, but also reflections on navigating professional environments as a woman in eras even less welcoming than the present. One entry from 1983 stood out. My grandmother had written about a male colleague who had taken credit for her analysis during a crucial board presentation. She had documented her response, which was not to confront him publicly or demand immediate recognition, but rather to quietly ensure that subsequent opportunities flowed through channels where her contributions would be undeniable, and his theft would become obvious through his inability to replicate her work. The entry concluded with a reflection that still resonated decades later. Power exercised loudly is often power that is insecure. True power operates quietly until the moment it must reveal itself, and then it speaks once and need not repeat itself. I had spent 4 years exercising power quietly, building infrastructure and creating opportunities while remaining invisible. Friday night had been the moment of revelation. Speaking truth once in a manner designed to eliminate need for repetition. But the aftermath was teaching me something my grandmother's journals had not fully prepared me for. That revealing hidden power generates resistance proportionate to how thoroughly that power disrupts existing arrangements. Derek had built his entire identity around being a self-made entrepreneur who succeeded through vision and determination. My revelation had not merely embarrassed him or damaged his reputation. It had shattered his fundamental self-concept, forcing him to confront the possibility that he was not the protagonist of his own story, but rather a supporting character in someone else's narrative. That kind of ego destruction generates desperate attempts at restoration, which explained the aggressive legal representation, the social media campaign, and the anonymous blog posts. Patricia had spent decades cultivating influence within Chicago's social and professional networks. Her status derived partly from her own family background but significantly from being Derek's mother, from the reflected glory of his apparent success. My revelation threatened her position by revealing that her son's achievements were substantially enabled by someone she had treated with consistent condescension. Acknowledging that truth would require acknowledging her own misjudgment and complicity, so instead she would fight to maintain the fiction that Derek had built his success independently, and I had somehow trapped or manipulated him. Marcus and others like him had invested in a worldview where successful men naturally attracted supportive partners, whose role was to facilitate rather than challenge or overshadow. My revelation disrupted that comfortable framework by demonstrating that the supportive partner might actually be the primary architect of the success being celebrated. Accepting that possibility would require examining their own relationships and contributions, which was uncomfortable enough that attacking my credibility became preferable to honest self-examination. I understood these dynamics intellectually, but understanding and experiencing were different things. I had anticipated resistance but had underestimated how personally destabilizing it would feel to be characterized as deceptive and manipulative by people I had known for years. Some part of me, despite everything, had hoped that confronting Derek with truth would generate reflection and growth rather than defensive warfare. My phone showed a text message from an unexpected source. Ryan's wife Jennifer, who I had met perhaps a dozen times during company events and social gatherings. "Can we talk? I have something I need to tell you about Friday night." I called her immediately, curious about what information she possessed that required private conversation. She answered on the first ring, her voice carrying urgency and something that sounded like guilt. "Thank you for calling back so quickly," she began. "I have been struggling with whether to reach out, because I do not want to involve myself in what is obviously a complicated situation. But I keep thinking that if I were in your position, I would want to know what I am about to tell you." "Go ahead," I encouraged. "Whatever you need to share. I appreciate you being willing to reach out." Jennifer took an audible breath before continuing. "About 2 weeks ago, Ryan and I attended a dinner party at Marcus's house. Derek was there without you. Marcus made some comment about Derek finally being free for an evening, and Derek laughed and said something about how you did not enjoy those kinds of gatherings anyway. Then the conversation turned to relationships, and Derek said something that has been bothering me ever since." She paused, seeming to gather courage to relay whatever Derek had said. He told a story about how he had been seeing someone else casually for the past few months, a woman he met through business connections. He said it was not serious but that he felt entitled to explore his options because he was the one generating income and success in the relationship. He said you were comfortable and convenient but that ambitious men needed partnerships with women who matched their level of achievement. The words landed with the dull impact of confirmation rather than revelation. Some part of me had suspected infidelity based on Derek's increasing absences, and the way his defensive explanations about late meetings and business travel had grown more elaborate. But suspicion and confirmation generated different emotional responses. "Several people at that dinner pushed back," Jennifer continued quickly. "Ryan told Derek that he was being disrespectful, and that if he was unhappy in the relationship, he should end it honestly rather than cheating and justifying it with nonsense about ambition. But Derek just laughed it off and said we were all being too serious. Marcus agreed with Derek and said that was just how things worked at certain levels of success." Jennifer's voice grew firmer as she continued. "I wanted to tell you immediately, but Ryan convinced me to stay out of it. He said it was not our place to get involved in your relationship, that you would figure it out eventually, that maybe Derek was just talking and not actually doing anything. But after what happened Friday night, after learning that you were the one funding everything and that Derek had no idea, I realized that my silence made me complicit in his disrespect. You deserved to know what he was saying and doing, and I failed to tell you because it was easier to stay uninvolved. I sat with this information, processing both the substance of Derek's infidelity and Jennifer's admission of complicity through silence. The infidelity itself was almost anticlimactic given everything else that had been revealed over the past 48 hours. Derek's belief that he had the right to date other women was not merely theoretical philosophy expressed in a champagne-influenced birthday speech. It was actual behavior he had engaged in and justified to friends who either agreed with him or remained silent rather than challenging him. "Thank you for telling me," I said finally. "I know it was not easy to reach out, especially when it requires admitting that you had this information earlier and chose not to share it. I appreciate your honesty now. Do you want to know who the other woman is?" Jennifer asked quietly. "I know her name and where she works." "No," I replied after brief consideration. Knowing her identity would not change anything about my situation or my decisions. She is not the problem. Derek's belief that he was entitled to conduct secret relationships while accepting my financial support and strategic assistance, that is the problem. His willingness to disrespect me both privately through his behavior and publicly through his statements, that is what matters. After we ended the call, I sat motionless for a long time, watching rain continue its steady assault on the windows. The infidelity revelation shifted something fundamental in how I understood the past 4 years. Every late meeting and business trip that I had accepted as legitimate now appeared potentially suspicious. Every explanation about needing space for professional development now seemed like possible cover for personal betrayal. The narrative I had constructed about Derek being dismissive and self-absorbed, but basically faithful, dissolved into a more complicated picture of active deception, layered on top of casual disregard. The question that surfaced was not whether to proceed with Monday's board meeting. That decision remained unchanged. The question was how I had allowed myself to become so invisible that Derek felt comfortable conducting an entire secondary relationship without concern that I would discover it. The question was what it meant about my own choices and patterns that I had tolerated being systematically erased from someone's life while continuing to fund and support that life. My grandmother's voice echoed from her journals and from memories of conversations we had before she died. She had warned me about making myself small to fit into relationships that required diminishment rather than expansion. She had told me stories about her own marriage, how she had suppressed her ambitions and intelligence for years before finally recognizing that she was suffocating under the weight of someone else's expectations and insecurities. She had described the moment of decision when she realized that being alone and fully herself was preferable to being partnered and performing a truncated version of her capabilities. I had heard those stories and believed I understood them, but understanding was not the same as living through similar experiences. I had thought that I was being strategic by remaining invisible, that I was conducting an experiment to see whether Derek would eventually recognize my value. The truth was more complicated and more humbling. I had been afraid that if I revealed my full capabilities and accomplishments, Derek would feel threatened or diminished. Afraid that my success would overshadow his and create relationship problems. Afraid that I would be too much, too ambitious, too intelligent, too successful for someone to love me completely. Those fears had led me to make myself invisible in ways that went beyond strategic experimentation. I had actively suppressed parts of myself to maintain a relationship with someone who did not actually know me or value what he did not know. I had confused accommodation with love, believing that if I made myself easy enough and undemanding enough and small enough, I would earn the respect and fidelity that should have been baseline expectations rather than aspirational goals. The rain intensified outside, wind driving water against glass in waves that created rhythmic percussion. I pulled out my laptop and opened a document I had started weeks ago but never finished. It was titled Lessons from Invisibility, and contained fragmented thoughts about what I had learned from 4 years of strategic self-erasure. I began typing, letting thoughts flow without censorship or careful construction. The document grew as I articulated insights that had been forming gradually since Friday night. I wrote about the difference between privacy and invisibility, how the former was healthy boundary setting, while the latter was self-betrayal. I wrote about the cost of performing for others' comfort, How each small diminishment accumulated into substantial loss of self. I wrote about mistaking silence for strength when sometimes speaking was the braver choice. I wrote about the particular trap that intelligent women sometimes fall into, believing they can manage or fix relationships through strategic patience and careful calibration of behavior. I had thought I was being sophisticated by remaining invisible and documenting Derek's failures, that I was conducting some kind of controlled experiment where I maintained power through knowledge he lacked. The reality was that I had given away power by allowing someone to define my worth through their limited perception rather than insisting on being seen fully. The document eventually expanded to nearly 10 pages, single-spaced observations about patterns and choices and consequences. It was simultaneously painful and cathartic to articulate these insights, to acknowledge my own complicity in creating conditions that enabled Derek's disrespect. He was responsible for his behavior, but I was responsible for mine. I had chosen invisibility. I had chosen to fund his life secretly rather than openly. I had chosen to remain silent about my capabilities rather than insisting they be acknowledged. Those choices had been mine, made for reasons that seemed valid at the time but appeared differently in retrospect. The question going forward was what different choices I would make, how I would rebuild my life with lessons learned from this extended exercise in strategic self-erasure. By late afternoon, the rain had diminished to light drizzle. My phone showed another message from Derek, his fifth attempt to reach me since Saturday morning. This voicemail was shorter than previous ones, his voice flat and defeated rather than emotional or pleading. Natalie, I talked to my lawyers about the board meeting tomorrow. They told me that fighting this would be expensive and ultimately unsuccessful given the documentation you have. They suggested that I accept whatever terms you are willing to offer, and try to preserve some equity in the company rather than losing everything through litigation. So I guess I am calling to ask what you want from me. Not what the board wants or what the lawyers have prepared, but what you personally need in order to move forward. I do not expect forgiveness. I do not expect you to change your mind about the relationship. I just want to know if there is any path where I come out of this with something remaining of the life I thought I had built. The message revealed Derek's evolution from denial through anger into something approaching acceptance. He was beginning to understand that his options were limited, and that resistance would only increase the damage. He had moved from trying to restore the previous arrangement through negotiation or intimidation to attempting damage control and salvage operations. I did not call him back immediately. Instead, I spent time reflecting on what I actually wanted beyond the immediate accountability of Monday's board meeting. The question Derek had asked was legitimate. What did I need personally, separate from the business and legal resolutions? I realized that what I needed most was space and time to reconstruct my own identity independent of his perception or presence. I needed to discover who I was when I was not performing for someone else's comfort or managing someone else's ego. I needed to test whether the power I had built in secret could translate into power I wielded openly without apology or minimization. I needed Derek to understand not just that he had behaved badly, but why his behavior was fundamentally disqualifying. I needed him to recognize that the problem was not simply that he had made mistakes or exercised poor judgment, but that his entire framework for understanding relationships and worth was distorted and harmful. I needed him to see that successful men do not have the right to treat their partners as disposable, that achievement does not justify disrespect, that taking credit for others' invisible labor is not entrepreneurship but exploitation. But I also recognized that Derek's understanding or lack thereof was ultimately separate from my healing and growth. He might never fully comprehend what he had done or why it mattered. He might continue believing that he was primarily a victim of my deception, rather than someone facing consequences for his own choices. His growth or stagnation was his responsibility, not mine to manage or control. As evening approached, I finally drafted a response to Derek's question about what I needed from him personally. I wrote it carefully, reading it multiple times to ensure I was expressing truth rather than either excessive harshness or inappropriate softness. Derek, what I need from you is acceptance of reality and accountability for your choices. I need you to stop characterizing this situation as something I did to you and recognize it as consequences you created through your behavior. I need you to acknowledge that I did not hide my capabilities, but that you never asked about them because knowing the truth would have complicated your narrative about yourself. I need you to understand that funding your business secretly was an act of generosity, not manipulation, and that your failure to question where resources came from reflected in curiosity about anything that did not directly serve your ego. Most importantly, I need you to stop fighting against accountability, and instead use this experience to become someone different and better than who you revealed yourself to be Friday night. I sent the message as a text rather than calling, preferring written communication that could not be argued with or deflected in real time. His response came within minutes, a single sentence that suggested he was at least beginning to grasp the magnitude of his situation. I will accept whatever terms the board proposes tomorrow. I am sorry for everything. The apology was inadequate and generic, the kind of statement people make when they recognize words are required but have not yet developed genuine understanding of what they are apologizing for. But it was something, perhaps the beginning of actual reflection rather than defensive maneuvering. Sunday evening faded into night, the city lights emerging gradually as darkness settled over Chicago. I ordered room service and ate dinner while reviewing documents one final time, ensuring I had comprehensive command of facts and figures for tomorrow's board meeting. The case was straightforward, the documentation irrefutable, the outcome essentially predetermined. Derek had no viable defense and his attorneys knew it. Monday morning would formalize what had already been decided the moment I spoke truth at his birthday party. But formal proceedings served important purposes beyond their immediate outcomes. They created official records. They established precedents. They demonstrated that consequences followed actions, even when those actions were committed by people who believed themselves immune to accountability. They showed that invisible power could become visible when necessary, and that speaking truth after strategic silence carried weight precisely because the silence had been strategic rather than imposed. As I prepared for bed, I reflected on the journey from Friday night's revelation through Sunday evening's preparation. 48 hours had transformed relationships, exposed truths, and set in motion changes that would ripple forward in ways I could not fully anticipate. Derek's life would be fundamentally different after tomorrow. Patricia would need to recalibrate her understanding of her son's achievements and her own judgment. Marcus and others who had enabled or encouraged Derek's behavior would need to consider their complicity. Ryan and the employees would navigate a restructured company with new leadership and different cultural values. And I would begin the process of constructing a life where I was visible by choice rather than invisible by strategic necessity. I would discover whether power held openly felt different from power held secretly. I would test whether being seen fully was worth the discomfort and resistance that accompanied refusing to minimize myself for others' comfort. My grandmother's watch ticked steadily on the nightstand, marking time as it had throughout her remarkable life and now through mine. She had promised me that becoming fully visible would be simultaneously liberating and costly, that insisting on being seen completely meant accepting that some people would prefer the truncated version and would resist the fuller truth. She had warned me that speaking after strategic silence generated particular intensity of response because people had become comfortable with my invisibility and would experience my visibility as disruption rather than revelation. But she had also promised that the cost was worth paying, that living fully visible in my own power was worth more than any relationship that required my diminishment, that respect earned through demonstrated capability was more valuable than affection granted in exchange for remaining small and unthreatening. Tomorrow morning would test those promises. Tomorrow morning would reveal whether 4 years of invisible power could transform into sustainable visible authority. Tomorrow morning would mark the formal beginning of my life as someone who refused to make herself small for anyone's comfort, including her own. I fell asleep with rain resuming its percussion against the windows, the city alive below me, Monday morning approaching with its necessary reckonings and uncertain possibilities. Monday morning arrived with unprecedented clarity, the storm systems that had dominated the weekend giving way to sharp blue skies and brilliant sunlight that made every surface of Chicago gleam, as though the city had been polished overnight. I dressed in a charcoal gray suit from Brooks Brothers, professional without being aggressive, authoritative without appearing to try too hard. My grandmother's watch was precisely fastened on my left wrist, and her diamond studs were secure in my ears. I looked at my reflection in the hotel mirror and recognized someone I had not seen clearly in 4 years, a woman prepared to exercise power openly rather than managing it from shadows. The Catalyst Ventures offices occupied the 23rd floor of a glass tower in the Loop, deliberately chosen for its proximity to the financial district and its panoramic views that reminded everyone who entered that perspective mattered. I arrived at 8:15, 45 minutes before the scheduled board meeting, wanting time to review final documents and center myself before the formal proceedings began. Jennifer Park was already present, her conference room transformed into a command center with documents organized in precise stacks and presentation materials queued on the screen at the head of the table. She looked up as I entered, her expression carrying the focused intensity of an attorney prepared for complex litigation, even though today's outcome was essentially predetermined. "Derek arrived 10 minutes ago with his counsel," she informed me without preamble. "Thomas Brennan and 2 associates from his firm. They requested a private conference with you before the board meeting begins." I told them that all discussions would occur during the formal meeting with full board participation, but Brennan insisted I relay the request. I set down my briefcase and poured coffee from the carafe that had been prepared, taking time to add cream and sugar while considering this development. Brennan's request for private negotiation suggested Derek hoped to avoid public accountability by reaching some arrangement before the board convened. The strategy revealed continued misunderstanding of my objectives. I was not interested in private settlements that would allow Derek to save face or maintain comfortable fictions about his achievements. I wanted formal recognition of truth and official documentation of accountability. "No private conferences," I confirmed. "Everything happens in the board meeting with full transparency and complete documentation. If Derek wants to propose terms or negotiate arrangements, he can do so in front of the entire board where his statements will be recorded and witnessed." Jennifer nodded, having clearly expected this response. The other board members began arriving. James Thornton is in the reception area reading the briefing materials I sent yesterday. Catherine Wu from Wu Capital called this morning to confirm she would be participating remotely via video conference. David Martinez will be here by 8:45. We have quorum and unanimous agreement to proceed with the agenda as outlined. The board of Catalyst Ventures consisted of 5 members including myself. I held majority control, but I had deliberately structured the board to include respected investors and business leaders, whose judgment commanded credibility within Chicago's financial community. James Thornton brought decades of private equity experience and an impeccable reputation for integrity. Catherine Wu had built one of the most successful venture capital firms, focused on technology investments in the Midwest. David Martinez was a former federal prosecutor, who now specialized in corporate governance and fiduciary responsibility. Their presence on the board was not merely decorative. Their participation ensured that decisions made by Catalyst Ventures could not be dismissed as my personal vendettas or emotional reactions. At 8:55, we assembled in the conference room. The board members took their seats around the polished table while Derek and his legal team occupied chairs along the wall, physically separated from the decision-making table in a configuration that emphasized their status as respondents rather than participants. Derek looked diminished somehow, his expensive suit unable to compensate for the defeated slope of his shoulders and the dark circles beneath his eyes that suggested he had slept as poorly as I had over the past 72 hours. Thomas Brennan, by contrast, projected aggressive confidence despite representing a losing position. He was perhaps 55 years old with silver hair and the kind of expensive dental work that signaled success in high-stakes litigation. His 2 associates flanked him with laptops open and documents ready, prepared to support whatever arguments their senior partner chose to advance. I called the meeting to order at precisely 9 o'clock, my voice steady and formal. "Thank you all for making time for this emergency session. The matter before the board concerns the ongoing funding relationship between Catalyst Ventures and Williamson Consulting Group, specifically whether that relationship should continue given recent developments regarding the company's management and leadership." James Thornton spoke first, his measured tone reflecting decades of navigating complex business situations. "Before we proceed with formal agenda items, I want to note for the record that I have personal knowledge of some of the circumstances under discussion. I have been in business discussions with Ms. Chun for several months and have observed her professional conduct and capabilities firsthand. I have also met Mr. Williamson socially on several occasions. I do not believe these relationships compromise my ability to evaluate this matter objectively, but I want the board to have full transparency about my connections to both parties." Catherine Wu's voice came through the video conference system with characteristic directness. "I have reviewed the briefing materials provided by counsel, including the funding history, management structure, and recent events that prompted this meeting. My preliminary assessment is that this situation raises significant questions about due diligence, transparency, and the appropriate boundaries between personal and professional relationships. I am prepared to hear arguments from all relevant parties before reaching final conclusions. David Martinez adjusted his reading glasses and opened the folder in front of him. I have also reviewed the materials. From a governance perspective, the central questions appear to be whether company management demonstrated appropriate fiduciary responsibility, and whether the funding relationship was structured and disclosed in accordance with applicable standards. I would like to hear from Mr. Williamson directly about his understanding of the company's funding sources and his oversight of financial matters. Thomas Brennan rose, clearly intending to control the narrative before Derek was required to speak. If I may address the board before my client provides testimony, I want to establish context that I believe is essential to evaluating this situation fairly. Mr. Williamson is the founder and chief executive officer of Williamson Consulting Group, a successful business that he built through vision, determination, and entrepreneurial capability. 4 years ago, when he was launching this venture, he received funding from what he understood to be a standard venture capital transaction with Catalyst Ventures. The terms were negotiated at arm's length through legal counsel. The documentation was professional and complete. The relationship appeared to be entirely conventional. Brennan paused for emphasis before continuing. What Mr. Williamson did not know, because it was deliberately concealed from him, was that Catalyst Ventures was controlled by his romantic partner. This concealment represents a profound breach of trust and raises serious questions about the legitimacy of the entire funding arrangement. My client believes he was entering a professional relationship with an independent investment firm. Instead, he was unknowingly accepting funding from someone who had personal motivations and interests that were never disclosed. Jennifer Park responded before I could, her voice carrying the precision of someone who had anticipated every argument and prepared comprehensive refutation. Mr. Brennan's characterization misrepresents both the facts and the applicable legal standards. Catalyst Ventures is indeed an independent investment firm, with a documented history of investments across multiple companies and sectors. The funding provided to Williamson Consulting Group was structured identically to investments Catalyst has made in 17 other portfolio companies. The terms were market standard. The documentation was prepared by outside counsel. The due diligence was thorough and professional. She pulled up a presentation on the screen behind her, showing Catalyst Ventures' complete portfolio and investment history. Ms. Chen's personal relationship with Mr. Williamson created no legal obligation to disclose her role as managing director of Catalyst Ventures, unless he specifically inquired about the firm's ownership structure. The investment documents clearly identify Catalyst Ventures as the funding source. Mr. Williamson signed those documents and accepted funding, without asking basic questions about who controlled the firm or what their backgrounds and capabilities might be. His failure to conduct standard due diligence on his own investors does not constitute concealment or breach of trust on Ms. Chen's part. Thomas Brennan's expression tightened with frustration at having his narrative immediately challenged. The legal technicalities may support Ms. Chen's position, but the ethical dimensions tell a different story. My client was in a romantic relationship with someone who was secretly controlling his professional destiny. That power imbalance fundamentally compromised the relationship and calls into question every interaction and decision over the past 4 years. I spoke for the first time since calling the meeting to order, directing my words to the board rather than engaging directly with Brennan. I would like to address the characterization of my role as secret or concealed. I have an MBA from Northwestern University's Kellogg School of Management, which I earned before meeting Mr. Williamson. I established Catalyst Ventures using inheritance from my grandmother, a successful executive and investor whose career spanned 4 decades in Chicago's financial sector. I have been actively managing investments and building the Catalyst portfolio for 5 years. None of this information was hidden or concealed. It was simply never discussed because Mr. Williamson never asked about my educational background, my professional activities, or how I spent my time during business hours. I pulled up a document on the screen, a calendar showing my schedule over the past 4 years with professional activities clearly marked. On average, I spent 30 to 40 hours per week managing Catalyst Ventures' portfolio, conducting due diligence on potential investments, and participating in board meetings and strategic planning sessions for portfolio companies. I maintained a professional office separate from our shared residence. I attended industry conferences and networking events. I built relationships with other investors and business leaders throughout Chicago's financial community. Mr. Williamson was aware that I left the apartment most weekdays and returned in the late afternoon. He never inquired about where I went or what I did during those hours. His lack of curiosity about my activities does not constitute concealment on my part. Derek shifted uncomfortably in his chair, and Thomas Brennan placed a hand on his arm as if to prevent him from speaking. But Derek stood anyway, his voice rough with emotion. I should have asked. I should have been curious about your life and your background and what you were doing every day. I should have seen you as a complete person instead of just my girlfriend who kept things simple. You are right about all of that. But you also made a choice not to tell me. You watched me believe things that were not true and you never corrected those beliefs because you wanted to see what I would do. The conference room fell silent as Derek's acknowledgement hung in the air. He had deviated from whatever script his attorneys had prepared, speaking instead from some place of genuine recognition that his position was indefensible except through radical honesty. I told people I built my business from nothing, Derek continued, his voice barely above a whisper. I gave speeches about entrepreneurship and determination. I advised younger founders about raising capital and managing growth. I presented myself as someone who had figured out how to succeed through my own capabilities. And all of that was based on a complete misunderstanding of reality. The capital I raised came from you. The growth I managed was enabled by your strategic planning. The success I celebrated was built on infrastructure you created while I took credit for the architecture. Thomas Brennan had risen and was attempting to interrupt, but Derek waved him off with surprising firmness. My attorneys want me to argue that you manipulated me or trapped me, or somehow acted unethically by not revealing your role. But the truth is simpler and more humiliating. I was so self-absorbed and so convinced of my own importance that I never bothered to look beneath the surface of my own life. I never questioned where opportunities came from or why obstacles disappeared or who was managing details that I assumed just took care of themselves. I constructed an entire identity around achievements that were not actually mine, and I did it because you let me. He turned to face me directly for the first time since the meeting began. You let me believe I was successful when really I was just the public face of your success. You funded my life and my business while I dismissed you as someone who kept things simple. You exercised more power in an hour than I have in my entire career. And you did it so quietly that I thought I was the one with power. That is not manipulation. That is just you being competent while I was being oblivious. The silence that followed Derek's statement was absolute. His attorneys looked stricken, clearly recognizing that their client had just demolished any defense strategy they might have constructed. The board members sat motionless, processing this unexpected moment of radical accountability from someone they had expected to fight and deflect. James Thornton finally spoke, his voice carrying something that might have been respect. Mr. Williamson, that was an unusually honest assessment of a difficult situation. I appreciate your willingness to acknowledge these realities rather than pursuing arguments that would have been technically available, but ultimately unpersuasive. Given your recognition of the circumstances, what do you believe would be an appropriate path forward? Derek sat down heavily, his moment of courage apparently exhausting his remaining energy. I do not know what happens next. I understand that I probably cannot continue running the company. I understand that my equity should be restructured to reflect what I actually contributed versus what I claimed credit for. I understand that my reputation in Chicago's business community is probably destroyed, and that rebuilding any kind of career will take years of work that I am not sure I am capable of. What I know is that fighting this would be dishonest, and I have been dishonest enough already. Catherine Wu's voice came through the video conference with unexpected gentleness. Mr. Williamson, I have been involved in business for 35 years, and have witnessed countless situations where people in your position chose defensiveness and aggression over accountability. What you just demonstrated requires more courage than most people possess. The board will take your statement into consideration as we determine appropriate next steps. Thomas Brennan had recovered from his shock and was now attempting damage control. The board should recognize that my client is speaking from a place of emotional distress, and may not be fully considering his legal interests. I would request a brief recess so that I can consult with Mr. Williamson privately before we proceed further. David Martinez shook his head firmly. Mr. Williamson is an adult and the CEO of a funded company. He is capable of speaking for himself and understanding the implications of his statements. His honesty reflects well on his character even as it complicates his legal position. We will not take a recess that would allow counsel to convince him to retract statements that appear to represent his genuine understanding of the situation. I had not expected Derek's testimony to unfold this way. I had prepared for aggressive defense, legal maneuvering, attempts to reframe the narrative in ways that minimized his accountability. His choice to acknowledge truth completely rather than fighting to preserve comfortable fictions represented genuine character that I had not been certain existed beneath the performative confidence he usually projected. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.